welcome back to the Haunted Book Club series we're doing on Dracula. This is certainly late. I know I said I would do two videos last week for Halloween with the last two sections of the book. That did not happen. Sorry to the 5 people who watched my previous videos and maybe were waiting on this. I'm sure you were waiting with bated breath. But I'm here now, and instead of doing two videos, I'm going to squish the rest of the book together into one video. I think we can definitely get through it in that time. And honestly, I mean, I don't want to give anything away. We're going to talk about it, but I felt the steam of the book, the energy, the intensity. Really, it was kind of front heavy there, and then as the book has gone on, I've felt my personal kind of steam, interest, engagement changing or decreasing slightly. So I think it's good to kind of fit these last two sections together. They're kind of, there's a lot that happens, but a lot of it's detail that I don't think we need to get too much into. I also just want to say it's a crazy time right now. Uh, you might have heard about SNAP benefits being withheld because of the government shutdown. Lots of people going without very necessary food support right now. Um, it's a good time if you're able to support local organizations feeding people, food banks. Um, there's mutual aid. I know in a lot of places, a lot of cities and things like that. And if you need help, there's a website called findhelp.org where you can search by zip code to find different resources available in your area. And, it ranges from food to all different types of resources. So we left off with Van Helsing basically being like, okay, Dr. Seward, Jack, my friend, Lucy's a vampire. And in order to convince him, he takes Dr. Seward on a nighttime excursion to the cemetery where Lucy's buried. And all the while, Dr. Seward's like, I need proof. I'm not really believing this. And so Van Helsing's kind of doing this evidence-based process to give Dr. Seward the facts that will convince him that this is something supernatural, that Lucy is in fact a vampire. And so they open up the tomb. It's empty. Lucy's body's not there. Dr. Seward's like, that doesn't prove anything. She could just have been moved. Someone could have moved her body. It seems like he's using this kind of extreme skepticism and logic, not only to emphasize, as Stoker seems to be doing, like this perspective of science and reason, which is really coming together at this time in society where a lot of the sciences are new and emerging, but people are really turning towards that as a way of understanding the world and kind of moving away from more superstitious, as characters in this book seem to describe it, or like older forms of knowledge and understanding. So Dr. Seward seems to be kind of a representation of this like new type of reason and logic in science. And Van Helsing's, as we kind of talked, he's kind of on the cusp. He is a man of science, but also is turning towards these sources about different folklores and cultural knowledge to figure out that they're dealing with a vampire. So he's kind of on the cusp of both a little bit. And so Van Helsing's like, all right, well let's kind of do a stakeout at the cemetery. Let's see if you'll see what you need to see to convince yourself that it's Lucy who is luring these children away at the night. And so they take posts in the cemetery, and Dr. Seward sees this white shape, or this white kind of like figure moving in the cemetery, and then he finds Dr. Van Helsing holding a child who seems to have been brought out there by somebody. And again, Dr. Van Helsing's like, who do you think got this child to the cemetery? Have you not kind of picked up on it yet? And it's now that Dr. Seward seems to be kind of uh, resistant, but like letting himself see what's really happening. And it might not just be skepticism as a form of like upholding science, but also because he loved Lucy, and this is a kind of a tough pill to swallow. So this idea that this woman that he loved has been turned into this like evil, corrupted entity is something that's really hard for him to accept. In addition to it being somewhat fantastical, if you're coming to it from a frame of like logic and science. So Van Helsing's basically like, we got to do something about Lucy. Basically, we are going to have to put a stake through her body and cut off her head, which is kind of, again, classic vampire, as we know it now, classic vampire death. Like, that's the way you get rid of a vampire. But Van Helsing is also realizing that this could cause some problems. You can't just go to a cemetery and do this to a corpse. If the person didn't believe that they were a vampire, at best this is desecration of a corpse, which in uh, a very heavily Christian society, as this book is placed, and a lot of the characters talk about Christian faith, that is a big, big no-no. So Van Helsing's solution is to get Arthur on board and to kind of get him to realize what's going on so that he, as the fiance of Lucy, would not be upset at what they're doing. So he brings he brings the group of men. They're kind of like a little buddy group now. Quincy, Dr. Seward, Arthur. He brings them to the graveyard and basically is kind of walking Arthur through the same things he walked Dr. Seward through, to be like, hey, I really hate to break it to you. I know you love Lucy, but she's a vampire now, and the best thing you could do for her is um, to be the one to deliver her from this evil fate that has befallen her. Like, if you are the one to, drive the stake through her, you are doing the ultimate compassionate thing. Um, you are saving her soul. And that's how he kind of convinces Arthur to be a part of this. And I go back and forth. Like half the time I'm like, this is Dr. Van Helsing truly being thoughtful, caring, understanding that Arthur needs to be the one to do this because he loves Lucy and he wants to be her ultimate caretaker, caregiver. This is like the ultimate form of care, is to make sure that she's not damned to a life of vampirism, you know, and that her mortal soul, or I guess now immortal soul, that she's dead, her soul and the eternity of her soul is at risk. Um, so half of me is like, oh, he's being compassionate and wanting Arthur to be the one to do it because of the significance. The other half of me is like, he's kind of like, well, I know this guy loves Lucy, and if he does it, we're less likely to face any legal ramifications. It's going to be less problematic on our end logistically. Um, so maybe if he does it, first of all, I don't have to do it, and then it kind of gets us, we can get away with doing this again for the greater good, because Lucy needs to be taken care of, or else we have a vampire on our hands. So it's kind of this. I can't decide if he's like a compassionate, caring guy, or if he's kind of a utilitarian guy. And I don't know. That never gets answered for me. I'm always on the cusp of both readings of Van Helsing. I think the utilitarian version is more interesting to me, but people may argue with that. Anyway, so Lucy, she comes back to the tomb, um, and she tries to convince Arthur using this form of seduction, and really, this is a part of this theme that's kind of been emerging of the women from when Jonathan was in Dracula's castle, the three women kind of using seduction to lure men in, to trap them. Lucy's doing the same thing. So Lucy, the corruptness of her as a vampire is, one of the manifestations is this like seductive aspect of her, which, taps into Victorian era concerns about sexuality, of repressing sexuality, of propriety, a woman being this outwardly seductive, sensual, whatever you want to call it, would not have been, socially acceptable. And women who were characterized that way were often looked down upon as immoral, corrupt. I, I kind of earlier in my, I think, first video was kind of saying I was hoping that the role of women in this book would become a little bit more dynamic, a little more interesting. But this again seems to be a stereotypical moralization of women and a way of showing that women are corrupt because they've given into this like seduction, this kind of outward sexuality. And I've been seeing that people kind of interpret it as both a commentary on the suppression of sexuality, but also it kind of seems to me in some ways to be just an outward condemnation of that kind of sexuality as a sign of corruptness. Anyways, they in the end she's not able to use her powers of suggestion to stop Arthur. He stakes her. They cut off her head. They bless the tomb with a communion wafer, and that's how they get Lucy. So now all the men are on board. They all understand that there's vampire stuff happening around them. And Van Helsing's like, all right, now that I have you on board, we need to come together to make a plan for Dracula because he's the one who made Lucy this way. And this is only going to continue as long as he's allowed to roam the earth. So he kind of brings the men together. And a lot of the headquarters happens to be Dr. Seward's office, his quarters in the asylum he works in. That's kind of where they converge. And so Van Helsing also asks Jonathan Harker and Mina to come so they can be a part of this planning. Mina, again, shows her value. I guess Stoker portrays her showing her value to this group and their mission by being a very detail-oriented record keeper. So she transcribes Dr. Seward's journal, and that's how they understand that there's a connection between the Carfax estate, which is where Renfield ran to that night he escaped, and the Carfax estate that Jonathan sold, or as the lawyer processed the sale of for Dracula when he was moving from Transylvania to London. So they're like, oh, Dracula lives there. And that's why Renfield has these different phases or spouts of different behavior. And Jonathan is like, hey, maybe we should look into those crates of earth that he traveled with. The ship and the log had the cargo as these 50 crates of earth. And theoretically, they would all be at that Carfax estate that he purchased. In the meantime, Renfield is he seems to be in this turmoil. He's asking to be let go from the asylum. He seems to be in a huge internal tension. He's asking to be let go, saying that he's trying to do what he can to it's unclear. He's never really speaking straightforward, but it sounds like he's doing this internal battle of something he's being called to do versus wanting to prevent that, assuming that Dracula is trying to use him to enforce his will, and Renfield's feeling fear over the consequences. Also, a sense of the consequences or what lies ahead for him as this fate for his eternal soul, being part of Dracula's plans. And that seems to be causing him a great deal of internal stress. And he just seems to be at this important moment about how his role in Dracula's plan is going to pan out, and that's why he's feeling this intensity. It's also in the section that Van Helsing kind of lays out the rules of the vampire. Things like he has to return to his place of rest. These crates with earth in them by, I think it's the break of dawn, or else he does not have his full powers. He's very weakened. He's very vulnerable. He kind of lays out the different rules about dealing with this vampire, which he learned through correspondence with a scholar in Hungary who's been doing research on this. So he's, conveniently got the parameters of what they need to do in order to best fight Dracula. And so a lot of focus begins being put on these crates, and it becomes the main strategy. We got to cleanse these crates, make them sacred using communion wafers. This is like Van Helsing's main tool. So that Dracula can't return to them. He cannot use them. They become inhospitable to him. And without these places of repose, without these places he can rest and return to, he will be kind of exiled into the daytime where he's weak and vulnerable. And it's so interesting that the tools, necessary tools, are these very Catholic things, crucifixes, the communion wafer. Jonathan at the beginning of the book is very staunchly Protestant, and he even talks about the idolatry of things like crucifixes, which is not something that in certain forms of Protestantism. So it is interesting that the characters in this book are mainly Christian, and Christianity and Christian values seems to be very prominent. Makes sense for the time period too. They're not Catholic characters, and yet these like Catholic ritualistic artifacts, you might say, or items seem to be the mechanism that they need to fight Dracula. So I don't know. Again, is Stoker tapping into this social tension, of Protestantism versus Catholicism, which has been a big source of tension in Ireland. It relates to also like a history of uh, colonialism, and also missionary work and the expansion of Christianity and the Catholic Church even before the Protestant movement. Like there's a huge social historical history behind that maybe Stoker's tapping into as being part of his world as an Irish author. This takes place in London, which you have uh, Anglicanism as one form of Protestantism, being rooted in the UK, but I think it's interesting that there's that. Not that they're inherently opposing, but it is interesting to have those two things happening here. And the book doesn't get more into that. It doesn't tap into that more. It doesn't explain that all too much. So there's that. I'm so sorry if I sound stuffy. I've been congested the past couple of days, so sorry. But another part of this section is a part that really got under my skin a little bit. All the men decide that it's best that Mina not be let in on anything else they're planning because it will just be too much for her. It will just be unbearable for her. And they need to think about her well-being and her mental safety, I guess, emotional safety. I think it's very rude to have built so much of their plan on her work. She's been the one to keep these records. She's been transcribing journals. She's already got all the backstory, and they're basically like she, can't handle the rest of this plan. It's no place for a woman, which is hugely like misogynistic, and also like uh, kind of chauvinistic in a way. These men assuming that like we'll get this done. We're strong men. We don't need to involve her. I do. I mean, as we talk about it, we'll learn that that was a mistake, and that involving Mina becomes important. So I guess there's kind of that redemption there, but I don't know. It's not it's not a strong enough redemption. I think of that to justify this part. Again, because the men aren't ever shown as being mistaken necessarily. I mean, they're foiled, and that's why they have to bring Mina back in. But there's not a huge critique of these men as if to say, "Oh, they're short-sighted," and that was a mistake. So I just don't think it's a huge redemption of that line of thinking later on in the story. So they go to Carfax to cleanse these crates, and they realize that not all the crates are there. In fact, 21 crates are missing. Only 29 are there. So that means that Dracula has since moved the other crates. So they cleanse the ones that are at Carfax. And there's an interesting part here that's reminiscent of an earlier part in the book. So while they're in Carfax, this big mass of rats come flooding into the space, and it freaks them out. And then Holmwood, the Arthur, summons these dogs to come fight the rats or to chase them off, and that's successful. But it's kind of funny because he just kind of like whistles or like calls these dogs, and it's kind of like Dracula summoning the wolves. So it's almost like this mirroring of a tactic Dracula used. But this time, it's not wolves, it's dogs. They're domesticated, they're not wild. They're serving these men, and their needs versus being kind of like this hungry pack of wolves that are unpredictable. So I don't know if, again, that's a commentary on Stoker being like, uh, we need civilized approaches, which is, tied into some other problematic things I saw in this book. And I have a rat terrier, Jimmy. Maybe I'll put a picture of him here so you can see him. And of course, it's inhumane to have this now, but rat terriers were bred to fight rats, and they would all like be put into rings as like entertainment to see who could fight off rats first. People would bet on it, and it's messed up and horrible. But I wonder if, because this was the time rat terriers were becoming more prominent, more popular, maybe Arthur was using rat terriers. I love to imagine like Jimmy running around. My dog couldn't do this. He's not built for that. But you would have a good time saying hi to everybody. Uh, Anyways, that is an unnecessary aside. But so they're trying to figure out where these other crates go, and Jonathan, using his background as a lawyer and inquiring through the connections, he discovers that there's two houses in London that Dracula has purchased. They come across one in Piccadilly, and I can't remember what the second one is off the top of my head. It'll come back to me. But so they realize the crates must be there. So of course that becomes the next plan of attack, essentially. When they return to the asylum, they find Renfield is beat up in his cell, and he's covered in blood, and it looks like he got into a big fight. And no one can really explain it. The person who was supposed to be watching him had fallen asleep. And so when they get in, they go in to talk to Renfield, and he's barely alive. And he basically confesses that Dracula had been using him to gain entrance into the asylum, and he, became upset because he realized Dracula was coming to see Mina, and I'll get to that in a second. And he felt betrayed, but also protective of Mina, I guess. And Dracula got upset that he was standing in his way or not loyal to him. Basically, Dracula beat the crap out of this guy horribly, and Renfield ends up dying of these injuries. And unfortunately, the men kind of just write it off as like, not write it off. They're aware of what happened, but legally and officially, they have to write it off as he fell out of his bed, so that people don't come around asking what happened to Renfield. So, kind of this clerical washing away of what happened to him. But big hint, Dracula is here where Mina has been, just waiting while these men do their thing. And we learned from Mina's writing that While the men have been away, she's been anxious, but she feels a little relief that she's not aware of what's going on, I guess. She's like, it's very scary. I feel like I'm very exhausted and I'm feeling this anxiety. And she begins to say, oh, I've had trouble sleeping. I feel like I've had this like mist come into my room. I wake up exhausted. All the things that were happening to Lucy, Mina's describing, but she just kind of writes it off. She is not connecting the dots, which is so frustrating that Stoker characterizes Mina here like this, because Mina has read the journal, she's transcribed things, she has the information. Um, and he's kind of already said, like, oh, Mina's smart. She knows the train timetable. She's deducing things. And then here to have her be like, oh, it's so strange that these things are happening to me that I guess I'm going to write off to being stressed. Like, I don't know if we're supposed to read that as Dracula using some kind of mind control to make her forget what's happening, or I don't know. But I just found that extremely frustrating, um, that Mina's intellectual abilities were kind of being underestimated here, I guess. Um, so we learned that Mina has been visited by Dracula in the night, which again we saw happen to Lucy, is not boding well. It's not good. Not a good thing for Mina. So the men, they're in Renfield's cell. He's telling them that Dracula's been visiting Mina. So they're like, oh my gosh, we didn't even know, because Mina has not been saying anything either to them because she doesn't want to bother them for something she writes off to just as kind of exhaustion and anxiety or stress. So they're like, oh, dang, Dracula's here right now. And they run up to Jonathan's room where Jonathan and Mina had been resting. And they break down the door. They find Jonathan passed out in the bed. And on the bed, Mina is kneeling, uh, and Dracula's leaning over the bed. Mina is drinking blood from his chest, which I think is strange, but I think is kind of this like innuendo. It's kind of intimate. It's, I don't know, weirdly, I think like sexual undertones here, um, and the fact that it's happening in the bedroom with Jonathan like in a trance next to them. There's this weird, I don't know, there's this weird undertone there. But they come in and see this, and Dracula, you know, reacts to them coming in, but they hold up a communion wafer, and he retreats, leaves the room. They're they rush to Mina, and they try to wake her and Jonathan, and Mina, as she comes to and realizes what happens, just freaks out and is screaming, is horrified, and Jonathan had been unaware completely of what happened. So they unfortunately have to figure out the story for Mina, but also let Jonathan know what happened. And this is bad. I mean, if you know vampire lore, it's one thing to have your blood sucked by a vampire, but if you're drinking the blood of a vampire, that's prime way to become a vampire yourself. So it looks like, Mina is experiencing a similar fate as poor Lucy. And so Mina's talking to the men, and she's trying to describe what happened. And basically, Dracula came into the room, and it's clear that he had kind of put Jonathan under a trance to keep him asleep. And he explained essentially his plan. He said, you have tried to thwart me by working with these men, but I'm going to make you part of me essentially. I'm going to turn you, you're going to be under my control so that you can't help these men anymore. In fact, I will use you um, to achieve my own ends. And this really upsets everybody for obvious reasons. But again, there's this sense of great loss that Mina has succumbed to this fate. I mean, she has not transformed yet, but she, is on that path. She has drank the blood, And Van Helsing holds up a communion wafer to her head, and it burns a mark in her head, and that becomes a symbol of her fall from grace, her impurity, and her corruptness. It's almost like the Scarlet Letter in the Scarlet Letter, um, which I don't know, maybe there's some influence there, but this external marking of unholiness in Mina, and it's this huge kind of contrast, that's kind of commented on by the men, but also that Stoker's really emphasizing of Mina being this virtuous, pure woman, very dedicated and loyal to her husband, um, now being this corrupted, unholy uh, thing, which, or at least on the pathway to becoming that. Obviously, she's not transformed yet, and it becomes this big crux of the story that they're not only destroying Dracula anymore, they're saving this woman from the evil that Dracula has forced upon her, that he's given her by this very unholy ritual that again taps into this like sensual, seductive thing. Like there's this kind of sense that this physical intimacy is part of what corrupted Mina. Um, and again, I think that ties into the same commentary I was mentioning before. Um, Very frustrating to me. Again, I mean, I think, you can look at this and maybe understand that Stoker is trying to expose that social anxiety, but I mean, Jonathan had the women try to seduce him, and obviously they were thwarted by Dracula stopping them from eating Jonathan or sucking off his blood, but the consequences for Jonathan being, you know, almost put under the spell of these women. I mean, he describes wanting to kiss them, and you could read between the lines. He was like being seduced. He didn't just want to kiss them, he was being seduced by these women. And he didn't really face very severe consequences for that to the same degree that Lucy and Mina did. I mean, Lucy and Mina became these symbols of corrupted women whose souls were on the line, who faced damnation. When Jonathan kind of got away without that much consequence. So I think it's interesting that, or even when Lucy tries to, lure Arthur in the tomb, he ends up uh, not succumbing to it. And I don't know what Stoker's trying to say there, but I do think it kind of lends itself to also this very frustrating dichotomy of like women as being more susceptible or weaker in the face of this type of temptation, and men maybe being less susceptible to it, or the consequences for men not being as real or as severe as they are for women. So I don't know. You could argue with me on that. Interested to hear other takes, but I just again felt kind of frustrated by that. Also, this like, oh, again, portrayal of Mina as this pure, innocent, virtuous woman, and then she becomes this tainted woman and this kind of like victim of the evil. And it's the agency I thought she'd have as a character doesn't seem to be playing out as strongly as I had hoped. So, we'll see how that plays out, but I kind of felt some frustration at that moment. All right, so the men kind of change their tune and they say, you know what? We said we were going to keep everything for Mina, but now we realize we have to let Mina in on what's going on. So, um, I guess too, if they had been talking to Mina and there had been that line of communication, and they hadn't been pretending that everything's okay, and Mina hadn't been kind of masking everything as being okay, maybe there could have been a different course of events. So maybe that's their consequence for kind of leaving Mina in the dark on all this. But uh, I really don't, again, think that that's a strong enough redemptive thing to make up for the fact that they're just like, let's just not tell Mina. But now they're like, okay, Mina, you're in on it. You drink the Count's blood. I guess it can't get any more psychologically or emotionally risky than that. So, so the men decide to go to the two houses, one in London, the other specifically in Piccadilly, to find the rest of the boxes, cleanse them so that Dracula can be fought out in the open, essentially. And then in doing so, they find that one box is missing. Um, and so they realize that they don't know where this box is, but Dracula's purposefully keeping one hidden as like his last ditch, like his safety net, his last place of retreat. Also, I forgot to mention this, but when they're in the house in Piccadilly, sorry, when they're in the house in Piccadilly, Dracula comes to the house and they have this interaction. They try to fight him then and there, but he ends up jumping out like a window and running away. So Dracula, it's become obvious to Dracula that they're on his trail, that they're finding his boxes, and so it's kind of this big decision point for Dracula of what to do. And so they're trying to figure out where the last box is, and how to catch him and purify that box and finally put an end to him. Um, and they kind of put it together that he must be retreating. He must be retreating. And part of this is Van Helsing explaining Dracula's strategy as a warrior back when he was, I guess, not an immortal vampire, back when he was just a warrior, that he would fight, and when he was no longer winning, or when his forces were being, um, beat down, he would retreat back and then fight again. So he's kind of using these pieces from Dracula's past strategy to explain what he's doing now. So he's like, he must be going back to his home in Transylvania. And then what also helps is they kind of understand, like, oh, Mina, Dracula's making this psychological connection with you by turning you into a vampire. So he can, control your thoughts, read your thoughts, see our steps, before we even do them. But can't that work two ways? Like, doesn't the phone work two ways? Mina, why don't we see if you can tap into Dracula? So Van Helsing hypnotizes Mina, and she's able to tell them that she is hearing water. She's, explaining what she's kind of seeing, which is not much. It's kind of dark, but she's hearing this water. They're like, oh, he's on a boat. They figure out he's on a boat. And from there, they deduce that he's on a ship that's going to go back to Europe. I think it's through a Russian port, so that he can make his way back to Transylvania. So they make travel plans to go by, I said back to Europe. They're in Europe, but back to Eastern Europe. I'm so sorry. They make plans to go by train, so that they can get there, kind of cut him off before he gets to his castle. So they're taking the train, and they keep hypnotizing Mina, and they keep, trying to reach out to different people along their route and use their kind of like network and their influence to kind of get people to keep them updated on news of the ship that Dracula's on. And eventually they find out that Dracula has kind of thwarted them by not going to the port they thought that he was, going a different route. So they have to kind of readjust. And they come up with this plan that they're going to split up. So Dracula has landed on land. He is being transported to his castle. Van Helsing, Harker, Holmwood, Morris, Quincy, and Mina are they're able to figure out, using maps, using logic, using some deductive reasoning, to figure out the path that he's taking to his castle. And they make a plan that Arthur and Harker will take a boat up the river to follow the path, and then Quincy and Dr. Seward will take horses and kind of go by land, and they'll work together to kind of cut off at the meeting point of where Dracula will be, so that they can get him. Meanwhile, Van Helsing and Mina take a carriage to Dracula's castle. So Mina and Van Helsing are kind of traveling alone, which again is kind of scandalous. I mean, they even talk about how Mina mentions in her journal how it's good that they're traveling fast and not staying anywhere long. No one can ask them questions about what they're doing. And Van Helsing's still trying to, hypnotize Mina to get what information he can, but her connection with Dracula is becoming weaker and weaker until eventually it's kind of, destroyed. In part, I think they mentioned that Dracula's caught on that, them having any psychological connection like that, psychic connection, I should say, is a threat to him as well. Um, so they're making their way up the pass in the Carpathian Mountains up to Dracula's castle. And Mina, it's obvious that she's becoming more and more susceptible to the symptoms of her transformation, of her slow transformation. And she begins to behave weirdly. She stops eating food. She kind of, her behavior and demeanor seems to change, and some of it seems to be forced. Seaward seems, sorry, not Seaward, Van Helsing seems to think that she's kind of pretending that she's fine. So it's clear that this is becoming critical for Mina, that, her time is becoming more and more threatened by this, potential transformation, this impending, I shouldn't say potential, this impending transformation. So one night when they're camping out, they're visited by the women that visited Jonathan in the castle. These 3 vampire women come to them. And Van Helsing has made a circle of communion wafers in the ground to protect them, but they're really trying to use the same strategies of luring, of seduction, but also they're calling out to Mina to join them. They're kind of trying to get her to join their ranks and to bring her in. And Mina's really having a hard time resisting, but really that line of communion wafers is their like last kind of shield from these vampiric women who are trying to lure Mina in, but also, I guess suck the blood, eat Van Helsing. So when they're unsuccessful in that, they kill the horses, which I was very sad about. That seemed a little unnecessary. Seemed a little spiteful on their part. And so Van Helsing realizes that he must, handle the castle and also these women, because they're, in a way, part of Dracula's plan. They're Dracula's. He's turned them, so they're kind of working with his plan. But also they're vampires. They're gonna be a threat no matter what. So he goes to the castle and he kills them like he did Lucy, the stake, and then cutting off their heads. And he describes how it was kind of a struggle because they look so beautiful and kind of, it's kind of gross, but Van Helsing's kind of describing them as being these like voluptuous, sensual women who are so beautiful in the castle, and how it was so hard to kill them because I think, he was falling under some of their seduction in a way, but he powered through and thought about, the stakes of everything, the consequences of Mina needing to be saved, and so he found it in him to do it. But again, this like sexualizing of women, both as their tool of like manipulation, but also like women's beauty and purity being interwoven, and also men viewing loss of a specifically beautiful woman as being something that's hard to deal with. And I mean, again, I think it ties into all the same things you've been talking about women's value being tied to this certain specific type of morality and also physical beauty, which even Van Helsing is susceptible to, I guess. So he does away with them. He purifies the castle grounds so that Dracula can no longer go there. He says, you're out of here. You're evicted from your own castle. And then he goes back to Mina, and from their vantage point, they're able to watch Arthur, Harker, and Quincy and Dr. Seward as they kind of converge on Dracula's crate that's being transported. So they're kind of up on the mountain viewing this happen. I think they have like binoculars or something. Perfect timing, really perfect placement. And so the four men who are traveling up the river all kind of descend upon these men that are carrying the crate at the same time, and they're trying to get them to stop. But the men who are transporting the crate are resistant, and they realize that these four people are trying to break into their cargo, they try to fight them off, and there's an altercation, and poor Quincy gets stabbed. But he keeps fighting. These are very dedicated people. That obviously they're fighting Dracula, so stakes are high. They're gonna do it whatever they have to, and the people who are transporting Dracula, they begin to understand that these men will stop at no cost, and they see also Van Helsing and Mina up on the mountain. They're just kind of like they kind of feel like they have no option but to let what happens. And so the men break open the coffin or the crate with the earth, and they find Dracula there, of course. And Dracula, you know, awakens and sees what they're doing, and uh, before he can even really do anything, Quincy lunges and stakes Dracula with this very heroic motion, and then they cut off his head, and he, falls away to ashes, and that's it. They got Dracula. After all that, they got Dracula. It was in fact Quincy who dealt the final blow. I mean, he staked them, then they cut off his head, but he got the stake in. So good on Quincy. I gotta say, Quincy quickly kind of stood out to me as like like my favorite character. He's such a minor character. Um, he doesn't do much, but he's just kind of like game. He's like, all right, if this is what we gotta do, we gotta do. He's a good sport. He will like run out of the like at one point he ran out of the house, and you just like they hear a gunshot, and they're like, what the heck? And Quincy comes in and goes, I'm sorry, I saw a bat and I shot at it. He's kind of like, you know, just comes off as very likable, kind of like unpredictable in some ways. I don't know if it's a stereotype of a Texan, going out and shooting his gun at bats and stuff, but he's courageous, he's supportive, um, and he's kind of the hero at the end. Like he's the one who stakes Dracula, and unfortunately, his wounds from being stabbed when he was fighting off the people transporting the cart, he dies from those. He succumbs to his wounds, which is a huge tragedy because I really liked Quincy. Sad to see him go. But at least he's the legacy of killing Dracula. However, sorry, I shook my whole thing. However, this is not something that people can know about. It's not like they're going to go broadcasting that they fought off Dracula. No one would believe them. No one would believe it was real. So poor Quincy can't even be memorialized for this amazing thing he did. He would be world famous if people could know as the man who killed Dracula. But unfortunately, only those people that are present that day know it. So he doesn't even get the legacy I think he deserves. So R.I.P. Quincy. But yeah, Dracula's dead. Just like that. Just like that. This hundreds of years old vampire. They just out logisticked him. They just figured out his travel route better than him and got there faster. And that was how they got him. So we get this little flash forward. I think it's 7 years. And Harker's and Mina, they're kind of living their life. They have a son and name him Quincy after Quincy. Everyone seems to be kind of have gone back to normal. Arthur and Dr. Seward also got married, so they kind of went on and lived their lives. I guess they kind of get visits from Van Helsing, but lives move on. They kind of write like, oh, wasn't that crazy that we did that? Wasn't that bizarre that we had that adventure? Well, such is life. So that's kind of the end, and I don't know if you can tell, I'm a little disappointed by how that ended. I think it didn't seem hugely climactic after this very compelling opening of Harker being in Dracula's castle and Dracula being this creepy, terrifying entity. Uh, yeah, just a little disappointing at the end there. But oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to mention. Uh, how did Dracula become Dracula? I'm still not 100% sure. Van Helsing was kind of describing it, and from what I understand, is that he described Dracula as being this fearsome warrior, this very successful warrior, and this very, very smart man. He was kind of like larger than life, so much so that he just kind of, I don't know if he willed himself or just could not be contained in his mortal legacy and thus became an immortal vampiric being. I don't know if that's exactly the case, but that's what I understood from what Van Helsing was saying. So is Dracula the first vampire? I don't know. He seemed like he just became one because there was no other option for someone that prolific. I really don't know. Anyways, so that's a summary. I did some talking points about things that frustrated me. I have a few more things though. Not to just rant about what I didn't like about the book, because like I said, when I did the first video, I was having a grand time, but things have changed. Things change. Books change as you read them. Um, but here's some other notes that I was thinking of, and like I mentioned, I've been reading this with a friend, so some things we've kind of discussed. One thing being kind of this book being xenophobic in a way, especially Dracula as an Eastern European man coming into London. There's this kind of this categorization or this characterization of like, oh, this evil entity from this foreign country in the East. You know, they keep emphasizing the East as it being like almost this other world completely. And I talked about that a little bit, but this exoticization of the East and this kind of like this characterization of it being something exotic and weird and different and far away, and then having the villain be from that land coming to London and being such a threat to the innocent lives there and corrupting it. You know, I've read some things on the internet, people talking about how this is maybe tapping into fears of immigration at the time, but it's really problematic and troubling. It's really um, not great to characterize this this man from Transylvania is coming in and being this like horrible, scary, evil force that's threatening the city. And um, I just it didn't at any point, again, like with the other kind of through lines, there's no kind of redemption of that line of thinking. The other thing that stood out to me that's something I'm kind of critical of is class in this book. I mean, obviously Dracula is this Dracula is this aristocratic man, powerful man when he was alive, and then he has this castle, and he's coming from this other country, but he's got power and influence and wealth, um, partially from being alive for hundreds of years. But even the other main characters, Harker, Arthur, Quincy, Dr. Seward, Dr. Van Helsing, um, they a lot of what they accomplish comes from their status in society. They're able to do a lot because of their profession or their wealth. And Mina at even one point is like, "Oh, look at what money can do." Like we wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't have money. And it's one way to kind of like describe how things are possible. It's kind of like to make sure there's no logistical issues or logistical loopholes. If we just have characters who have a lot of money, they can do lots of things and like get things done. So it saves the effort of having to explain how you could do what they did. But also, it seems to be like power and your ability to do things in society is related to your status, your class, your wealth. And even when the characters interact with working class characters, the working class characters are like caricatures. They're like kind of stereotyped and you know, I think that that's possibly social commentary, but again, it gets weirdly muddied into this idea of like these men as heroes and being virtuous and fighting this like very noble fight and doing it because of where they stand in society. Their status makes this possible. Sorry, I'm shaking the table again. But I think that that's something that, yeah, again, frustrated me because I don't think if most of this wouldn't have happened if Jonathan wasn't a lawyer and can pull some strings. If Arthur didn't have so much money, even Quincy's wealthy. He's an American. So I mean, I think maybe the way he navigates society, he's not maybe he doesn't have the same networks as these folks do. But like Dr. Seward, he's a doctor, and maybe he's not as wealthy, but like you know, he's a doctor. And I just yeah, I thought that maybe Mina's character would add some nuance to that when she was saying she was an orphan and I don't know. It didn't really come through. It either felt like that was a loose end or that didn't really matter. So and of course Lucy's family is very wealthy. And so I think that that wealth and status are benefits to these characters. I mean, they're privileges, but like kind of uphold some of the virtuous values that they have, which frustrating part of the book too that I just don't think contributes so much to the story and kind of made this section very dull because I think it was so much about business connections and logistics and who can you talk to find out where these crates went and who can you get a locksmith to keep open the door, and it just wasn't as interesting because of that. um I know I've been talking for a long time. I just want to say, I'm going to add really quickly that I watched Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie with Gary Oldman that I talked about in the last video, and honestly was surprised at how close to the book that movie was. I think it was actually a very, compared to other adaptations I've seen, like pretty close to the book. There was some significant differences. What I will say is that movie really took these sexual elements and turned them to like 100. Uh, very, very sexualized. A lot of the parts of the book. And the Dracula's kind of made a little bit more relatable in a way, like more human in a way, because they, instead of him just willing himself to become a vampire because he's like this larger than life character, his wife dies after finding out that she thought he died in war. It was a false report, but she throws herself off the castle thinking he's dead. And when he comes back home from battle, finds out she's dead and he can't cope with a life without her. So he renounces the church and basically becomes a vampire because of that. It's a very cool scene, I will say, if you haven't watched it. So there's the explanation, which I think is a little bit more compelling than the one given in the book. But then throughout the book, like he's driven by this love of his wife, and um, who I guess Mina in the movie. Sorry, spoiler alert. Mina's like a reincarnation of his wife, and so Mina's like drawn to Dracula in a way she's not in this book, and he has these like moral kind of quandaries about like, oh, do I turn you into a vampire? Like you have to be damned to this life of immortality but also of evil with me, and do you want that? And he has like some conflict, and it's a lot more nuanced. But also that oh, crazy wig, that was wild. The costume design, the wig design, amazing, great in this movie. I think that the creative liberties they took were interesting. Sometimes I think they helped the story, but they really, followed the plot in a lot of places, much more so than some of the other adaptations I've seen. Keanu Reeves, I'm sorry, I love Keanu Reeves, but he's not the best actor. That comes through a lot at some points. I think he forgets how to do the accent he's doing. Sorry, Keanu. I still loved you in this movie because I think you're great, but wasn't the best performance of your life. Um, yeah, and what's so interesting is that the elements of like sexual corruption are very prominent in that movie, and it's not really doing anything new or interesting with that. I mean, besides maybe Mina as the reincarnation of Dracula's wife, she has a little bit more complexity around her decision making and a little bit more. She's pulled in different directions, and her character arc is a little different because of that. Um, in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, obviously Mina's very different. She's kind of characterized as having this psychic connection with Dracula since she was young, and kind of being committed to him from a young age. And she is a little bit more direct as a character. Maybe not a lot more direct. She's more of a powerhouse in the Nosferatu, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. But also her sexuality becomes something she uses as like a tool to bring Dracula down. And sorry, spoiler alert, I should have said. But I know that's interesting, and I've had some friends have kind of mixed reactions to that part of it. But I think if you're looking at that being so prominent, sexuality and like sensuality and like the corruption of seduction and promiscuity being so prominent in the original book, I think it's interesting that Robert Eggers was trying to figure out a way to have that play out differently in his movie. And you know how like the success of that, I think I'm still deciding that. But um it's a little different that Bina was able to say, "Hey, I'm going to use my sexuality to, you know, to to gain some power in this dynamic." Whereas in the book, it was like that is the downfall. I also want to say, like, I think it's hopefully obvious, but like, I don't think it's fair to say that Mina or Lucy were consenting to anything of these things that happened to them. They're obviously like manipulated, and um, so I think that's another frustrating part about that being so prominent in the book is that they're not consenting to what's happening to them. It's something that they don't really have a choice or say in the matter. They don't have agency or power in what's happening to them, and so for that to be what corrupts them is so frustrating, and it feels just so not right. It just doesn't feel good to have that be the message in certain parts of this book. So I hate to say it. Uh, this book, the last part of this book, just didn't grip me, did not hold me, did not keep my interest the same way that I thought it would from reading the first section. And I'm a little disappointed in how some of the themes came out. Um, I would love, again, if you feel differently, if you have different perspectives, if you feel like maybe something I'm saying is not quite spot on, let me know. Like, I would love to hear your analysis. Or if you have more insight into certain things, I would love to know. Always curious to hear more. But that's Dracula. That's not the only influential vampire book. There's vampire stories that predate Dracula, but one of the most influential, I'd say, in the pop culture sphere. So um, I'm excited to explore other books. Uh, I think I have the one in mind I'm going to do next, but I'm not going to say it yet, just in case. But thank you for journeying along on this, and I hope you'll stick around. I'm going to probably change the format from one book in 4 sections to one video per book. Keep it easy. But this one, first go of it, just wanted to see how the format worked, but also it seemed pretty substantial. So, and obviously I talk a lot. So thank you for sticking around through this iteration of the Haunted Book Club, and I hope you join me for the next one. All right, take care. Bye.